talk to me. Talk to me in your own special way. Welcome, New Mexico, to a special edition of Dialogue called
Listen to Us. We are Gen Z.
If you haven't heard of us, now you will.
Because we're going to lay it down for you real clear.
So, who are we?
We're not the millennials. We're the next generation.
And we're here to tell it like it is.
I'm your host, Jackie, and joining me today are my co-hosts,
Cassandra.
And little Sophie J. And just in case you wanted to comment live via Facebook, you can go to KSFR's Facebook page and comment live as we're on the air right now. We'll be standing by to hear your comments, and we would love to hear your feedback.
All right, so last time we were talking about the effects of drugs that we had personally seen in our own lives from our peers and in school, and we gave our opinion on that. But today, we would like to bring it to a more global stance, and we'd really like to discuss and open it up to the effects of psychiatric drugs and often the abuse of them. So, would we like to start off? Yeah.
I think that the first thing we have to talk about is the different types of countries and regions that this drug abuse happens. You know, maybe these second, third world countries aren't getting that many drugs, so they start going to abuse other things. But what kind of drugs are they abusing in these, capitalistic first world countries? Like, what about the U.S.? What about China? What about Russia? Like, what do you guys think is probably the biggest issue?
I think that often people believe that because we're so advanced in America, we have so many medications ready available that, surely we must be making a lot of progress and, mental health issues should be on the decline. But I recently read a book. It is Anatomy of an Epidemic. And it really dissected this idea that drugs are somehow the magic solution to mental health. But the author instead pointed out that these drugs should actually be the cause and really fueling this mental illness in America. And like you were saying earlier, like, what about these other countries? I mean, can we look at the effects? And often, as he was doing his research, he found out that in these third world countries where these drugs weren't always available, they couldn't always consistently take them, their mental illnesses were actually a lot lower than ours were, just because they weren't consistently on these drugs. They took them occasionally, like when things were really bad, they would take their medication, but they didn't have enough to take it every single day, and because of that, the effects were somehow less.
Because when you're taking the drugs every day, you create a dependency on them. And then that's when we see, like, with the recent shootings, when they're taking off their drugs, their entire mind, their entire psychology, everything is offset now, and they have to be able to live on their own without the drugs. And that's what creates the violence and America's problem with mass shootings.
Right, and I think this whole fake understanding that Jackie was talking about of mental illness and depression or anxiety, you don't really have an understanding of what goes on. Like, these pharmacies, these drug companies, they make it seem like they have the answer, but in reality, these drugs could be doing more harm than good.
Yeah, and we especially see that in our youth. I mean, I feel like it's really becoming more and more common to where this kid has a problem, they're not acting or behaving as they should, or they're problematic. Well, let's try putting them on these psychiatric drugs. And they don't necessarily look to therapy, which could definitely be far more helpful. But I feel like in America, we have this mindset that drugs are an easy fix. And while we've put a lot of research into them, there's a lot of science behind it. Surely this must be the solution. There couldn't be anything wrong with it. Because some people really do experience relief from these drugs. I mean, there's no denying that. Some people really do rely on these because they make them feel normal. They feel like they can actually have a real life and not be controlled by their mental illness. But I feel like there's a flip side of the coin that people often do not want to acknowledge or even admit is there.
But do the companies want us to believe that? Is that what? Is there a conspiracy theory going on here?
Oh,
are the drugs
so
really
many.
helping us, or are they just making us worse?
There's so many conspiracy theories. And in that seminar that I watched, it talked about this Anatomy of an Epidemic, this book, and it talked about how, like, especially in the 90s when this antidepressant drug was first being formed, you know, they thought they had the answer to depression in a mental form. They thought that it was low levels of a certain chemical in your brain, and so they made this drug and to boost those certain chemicals, and they put it into patients that were experiencing depression. And even though it didn't prove their theory that this was actually where the depression was coming from, they released the drug even when they weren't supposed to, because those pharmaceutical companies wanted money. And that's still the case. You know, antidepressants are probably the most hooked on drug in America right now. You know, people depend on antidepressants more than a lot. And, you know, like anti-anxiety drugs, that kind of stuff is just like, even like in the moment you feel so like worried about what's going to happen to you that you go straight to the drugs. And that's where these companies get their money from.
Mm-hmm. Companies like just giving you drugs because they make money. Going to a therapist and being prescribed the drugs, that's easy income for the perpetrators of this terrible crime. They're ruining our youth.
Definitely. I mean, I feel like there's almost like a placebo effect here, as in, like, I'm taking this medication to make me feel better. And I feel like in your mind, you might think that you're feeling better, but you may really not be. I was reading this article online in Mad in America by Peter Bregan, and he was explaining that antidepressants are actually probably one of the number one psychiatric drugs that cause violence and changes in mood. Next are like medications for ADHD or anti-anxiety, but they they can cause insomnia, nervousness, anxiety, hyperactivity, and irritability, and aggression, agitation. And as he was doing this research, you know, like, he found that the FDA, they had to put these warnings on there, but I mean, often when does that really stop people from taking these drugs? Like, oh, it could happen, like, it's not going to happen to me. But
and also people that were taking the drugs and then ended up committing a crime because they're the violence, and they became more violent, and they went to jail because of the drugs, and then they continued taking the drugs because they believed that it was helping them, and the guards believed it was helping them. So that they continued to take the drugs that made them commit a crime in jail because they believed so much that the drugs were helping them, when in fact it's what got them into jail in the first place.
Yeah, that's so weird to think about. Like, you know, if you're having these kind of problems, like if you're depressed or if you have anxiety and you don't take these drugs, you could just as well lash out in anxiety or in rage or whatever. And, you know, if you take these drugs and they enhance that feeling, you know, what are the drugs really doing for you? You know, if they're just making you want to do what you were already going to do unwillingly because of what's being built up inside you, that's so weird to think about.
But I mean, also think about, so we see that these drugs are definitely harmful, but, you know, I also said earlier that they also do help some people, especially some people with the more serious mental illness, such as like schizophrenia or, you know, bipolar disease, and that they experience this depression and mania, which, you know, could lead them to suicide, just these varying emotions that they need some kind of stabilizer. And I mean, you know, you look at a lot of the research done for these, and I mean, what they do is that they give them these medications as kind of like a short-term temporary thing, and then later on they're taking them away from them. And, you know, it's often compared to, you know, taking medicine away from a diabetic, you know, taking the insulin away. Like, that's cruel. Why would you do that? It's obviously helping them. But so we kind of have this mindset of like, this is the only fix and we can't mess with it, or else, you know, we're going to ruin someone's life. And I mean, what do you guys think? Like, how do you think that we could possibly even begin to fix this epidemic?
I think a big part of it is just like there's such a diverse opinion on drugs in general, and psychiatric drugs kind of get mixed into that. Like if you have surgery and you start taking pain meds for that, like that could lead to some serious stuff. And so like just these like hardcore medicines, like I think the first thing would be just to like distinguish like how this is helping someone or how it isn't, and make each case individual. Because when you group all these people and you're just saying like, oh, they have depression, so you have to give them this drug, like no, they could have depression along with schizophrenia, like you said, or so many other things could be a factor, and so you have to treat every case individually. And these pharmaceutical companies aren't doing such a good job of that because they're not the doctors diagnosing them. They're not getting the whole story.
Like in Nicholas Cruz's case, people went to go check on him after he was making threats and after he was making it clear that he was planning something and his violent urges were taking control of him. And when people went to go see him, they didn't go to see him. They just wanted to investigate. But they didn't really look into his case, and that goes along with what you're saying, that they're brushing aside like the little symptoms just to put in a bigger picture to make it easier to prescribe the easy drugs, instead of really taking into account that every person is different and psychologically every person is going to act out differently.
And just to clarify, Nicholas Cruz was the shooter of a recent school shooting who was investigated by the Department of Children and Families because, there were concerns from his school and also his mother that, he wanted to buy a gun with no apparent reason, and there was concerns as to his mental health if he should be buying a gun. And after this investigation, they concluded that he was a low risk for violence, which a couple months later he went to shoot a school. So, this article that I was referring to earlier on madinamerica.com, it discusses how we could possibly link these psychiatric drugs to school shootings and to these outbursts of violence. So that was just to clarify who Cruz was and exactly what his story was.
Because killing 17 people isn't low risk. And it just shows that the government has failed us and has failed its youth in terms of they didn't really care about the person and what was happening in his life, and they wanted to make their quick bank and wanted to go on to the next thing.
Yeah, we definitely need to make healthcare more personalized and fit it to the individual, in that, this drug may seriously affect this person in a negative way, whereas, maybe psychotherapy would be more beneficial to them, or perhaps a mix. And I believe that we just need more time to stop and think and take a step back or two and look at this person as an individual, not as just another statistic or just another pocket that you could take money out of.
It's true, and I wonder, like, we're talking about how a lot of people won't go to psychologists, they won't go to therapy and all this stuff. Do you think that maybe the doctors are prescribing the medication before the therapy, or do you think that even if they do get prescribed the therapy, the patients just don't want to go because of that fear of talking about their problems? Or I don't know, because it's weird to think about how these drugs who bring in money are a better option, quote unquote, for most people than going to someone who is trained in a position where they can help you, who that's their whole career, that's their whole life. Weird.
Go ahead.
I was reading something in the article we were talking about earlier, and it said that the people that were experiencing the dark feelings, they didn't want to go to a therapist in fear that they're going to be put in jail for exposing themselves, like for telling people what was happening in their heads. And I think we need not become more comfortable with the idea, but become more comfortable that we have those ideas and that we need to get over them. We need to be able to talk about them without fear of going to jail.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like, most people, if they were given a choice, would you rather take a drug that will magically fix all your problems, you'll feel normal again, or go and sit in a room with a stranger and talk and admit that there's something wrong with you and try and identify that and really admit that, you have something wrong psychologically with you. I mean, I feel like it's just so hard to be that vulnerable. And I really do believe that drugs it's just such an easy fix, and people turn to that when really it shouldn't be the solution. I mean, really, when these drugs were being introduced, they weren't meant to be taken long term. They were meant as short term solutions until, they would hope that this short term, release of certain hormones would somehow fix them, and they didn't think of the long-term effects, and they couldn't really know. And even now, we're really seeing those effects, that the long-term effects are really, really dire, and that mental illness is really on the uprise in America and many other countries as well.
Yeah, I think the dependency on the drugs is really, like, one of the most surprising things, because, like Jackie said, when they made these drugs, it was supposed to be, like, a corrective measure, and you were supposed to take them, and it was supposed to, like, cleanse your body and make it work properly, and then you could stop taking them. But what happens when it takes years for your body to start working again, and then you don't want to give them up because you're afraid of what it'll do to you if you stop taking them, or what it'll do to you if you need them again, and you have that period where you're just not on anything, and you're at that low point where you just need, where your body feels like you need that drug in your body.
Because you physically become addicted. Like, your body craves the drugs. You're not able to live without them anymore.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of suggested it earlier, but are there any other solutions that, we think that we could possibly take, like, specifically? Or is this something that that is just going to continue on a downward spiral and we just have to accept?
I think people should start looking into the medical marijuana industry and start using the resources there, because marijuana isn't as addictive as the drugs. It becomes more of a habit, not a physical addiction. You can become mentally addicted to the task of using marijuana, but it's not something that comes physically addictive. And I think it's a safer alternative. And also, so in veterans that had signs of PTSD, they were prescribed antidepressants and drugs, and they go into a dark place in their mind, and the drugs really hinder on their life. And they gradually were able to switch to the consumption of marijuana, whether it was in edibles or smoke or however one wants to use it. And it just becomes you're able to live at a state of life where you're not dependent on the drugs and you're not dependent on the pills, and instead you're able to carry on with your life while using the aid of marijuana to help you. And I think that we're so scared of it. It's such a taboo topic to talk about because of the past generations. We're scared of it for some reason still, but there's no scientific evidence that says it's any worse than any other drugs we're taking. And there's evidence that says that these antidepressants are harming the people that are using them, and they'll end up eventually maybe harming others.
Yeah, no, I really have to agree with you. I've seen multiple documentaries about it just because, honestly, I was curious, because it just, to me, when I hear about it, it just seems like such a great alternative to these really serious drugs. And, so this documentary was called Weed a Kit. It was on Vice. But it followed multiple families, and one specific segment of this, or episode of this documentary, it was about the medical use of it. And, often what is being used is the oil that they use, that they break down from the actual plant. And a lot of the cases I was really surprised was children that they were using it for. Mm-hmm. And these children, they were often called like the hopeless cases, to where no medication is going to help them at this point. They're just kind of waiting for these kids to die. And I was really surprised to hear that they turned to marijuana and the oil of it. And it's the CBD oil and also THC. But especially in cancer patients, they were using this, and they really did see dramatic changes and improvements in these children. And, of course, there was always kind of like, well, the parents are saying like, well, I kind of feel guilty that my child is high right now, but they're better. Like,
how is that any worse than popping pills?
Definitely. And I think it is a taboo subject in that, like, oh, you're high right now, like, off of marijuana, really? Like, it's somehow seen as dirty, and, like, only lowlifes use that, or, or just bum teenagers or something. And I think that we really do need to shift from that view and, possibly just look into it. Like, maybe this really is a better solution. Maybe this, along with therapy for mental illnesses, it could really help. And so I really did think this documentary, it was very interesting in that these cases that I would definitely not expect. I mean, these were like 2-year-old, 3-year-old children, and they would give them to them in like edibles, like gummies, or they would just give them the straight oil. And, you need very little of it because of how potent it is. But, I mean, you need a very, very large amount of any kind of marijuana to overdose. Whereas
there's no overdoses. I've done zero deaths of marijuana.
Well, I've done the research, and you have to smoke, like, over 15,000 pounds of marijuana to die. So, yeah. So, I mean, it's not really plausible and that's just within a 30-minute window. That is what that's how much you would have to smoke to overdose on marijuana. Whereas you look at these pills, and how easy is it to OD on these kind of pills, or just become a complete mess on them. Mm-hmm. And so, I totally agree with you. I think that is definitely a plausible solution for this epidemic.
I think that is a really good solution. And, like you guys are saying, a lot of people don't treat it like it's a real drug. They treat it like it's something dirty, something that only high school kids use because, like, what else can we afford or whatever. But I think that's really a good idea. And I liked how you brought up the PTSD thing with the people who come back from war, because I think that's really important, like, especially the people from the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, like all this stuff, like they came back and they were messes. Mm-hmm. And like nobody could figure it out. Nobody, like they called it shell shock until they actually found out like what PTSD was. And I mean, like we all know someone who has PTSD, like we all know that. And I mean, it's just like really interesting because that's another aspect of this whole mental illness thing and what we can do to help.
Definitely. All right, so it is time for a break. And when we come back, we will continue this discussion of possible alternative solutions to these drugs.
And in case you just tuned in, you're listening to a special edition of Dialogue called Listen to Us.
All right, and we're back. In case you're just tuning in, we were just talking about the effects of psychiatric drugs and their abuse. And right before the break, we were talking about possible different solutions to help with this epidemic of psychiatric drugs and abuse of them. We were previously talking about the possibility of using marijuana and, possible uses for PTSD, for even cancer, and a multitude of ages and people. So let's continue on.
I think the medical marijuana is definitely a viable option, and I think that, switching to marijuana in the first place could also be beneficial to helping people of all ages get off of drugs completely, because like Sophia was saying, it's not addictive. Like you don't miss it when you're not doing it as much as these drugs that are like detrimental to your health. You know, if you don't take it, you start going crazy or you start lashing out. And I think that medical marijuana is definitely a better way to ease into that drug-free life if you want it. Like, you don't have to do it anymore. Like, if you get to a point in your life where you don't have to take, if you don't have to smoke marijuana, if you don't have to do that, like, if you get to a point where you rely on yourself more than anything else, then that would be something to extremely consider, because that's a very big step in someone's life with mental illness. You know, if you go from depending on psychiatric drugs to going on healthier habits like therapy, like marijuana, like all this kind of stuff, you can eventually get off of all of that and live a normal life.
I also feel like the introduction of possible medical marijuana to younger generations could really help with this whole epidemic that we're seeing in the younger generation of taking these prescription drugs. In that, you know, if you say, I mean, I've seen it, kids that they'll go to a party or something and, you know, they'll just start taking they'll just start taking these pills, and, you know, it's for fun for them, and they don't take it very seriously. And I don't really think they consider the consequences of what could happen to their body and to their mind just by taking, you know, Xanax for fun. And I really don't believe that marijuana has the same effect. I don't feel like if you smoke marijuana or eat it or anything else that afterwards you're completely altered to where you're now completely dependent on it. It doesn't happen like that. And so, I mean, I think that, you know, of course there's always this negative connotation from adults that, you know, kids who smoke weed, you know, they're bums. They're not going to do anything with their life. They're just going to sit there stoned until, you know, they eventually have to go on like welfare checks, or, you know, they can't make a life for themselves. And I feel like, you know, this idea behind it is really what kind of causes that, honestly. Like, if anyone, you know, if you hear anyone talk about marijuana, it's usually negatively. And, you know, I think if there's someone using it and, you know, they hear it, then I feel like that's what gets to them, as opposed to the weed getting to them, in the sense to where they don't want to do anything with their lives, or, you know, they don't want to be successful. I really don't feel like that is the case.
I think it's because it's still illegal federally. Like,
yeah.
If you're not knowledgeable on marijuana, then you think that it's just as bad as heroin, because that's what the government is telling us, that it's just as bad as some of these really highly addictive, really disgusting drugs. And in fact, marijuana is being used to cure patients, help them reach a better life, and it is not a gateway drug. And I'm a ganja advocate all the way, but when you were saying earlier about instead of giving kids pills, we should start having them smoke or whatnot. Do you think that maybe we should just calm down on prescribing anything to kids? Do you think we really just need to stop and let kids develop until their minds are fully developed and they're able to determine if something's actually wrong with them or not? Because really, do you think we're over-diagnosing little kids?
That is a touchy subject, because, you know, kids, there's so many things that vary, you know, like whether something is mentally wrong with the kid or whether they're just growing up, or there's so many different things, and their brain is still developing. You know, brains develop until you're like 20. So like how are you supposed to decide whether you put these drugs in them as a child, or you wait to see if it pans out? Because if you wait, it could get worse, and, you know, so many things could happen if you don't take action. But so many bad things could happen if you do take action, like giving them pills or giving them marijuana when it's too early for them, when they don't need it, and that kind of stuff.
Definitely. I mean, honestly, I think that like I said earlier before the break, that healthcare should definitely become more personalized, and that we can't just have a one-size-fits-all solution. In that, I really believe that you really need to evaluate the certain case first, because for some kids, it really may just be they're growing up, they have behavioral issues, like it happens. But I also feel like there are, and you really can't deny it, that there are young kids that have serious issues and really do need help, and oftentimes just therapy isn't enough. I feel like we should have a more specialized blend for them, in that, well, maybe this certain, maybe marijuana does help them, but maybe it doesn't, And so I think that we need to stop this dependency on pills and thinking that this is it, this is this is end of the road, this is as good as it gets. And we really need to push for continued research on this and finding a way to better our mental health as a whole in America. And definitely, I don't think that we should just straight up be prescribing just because, I think that something's wrong with this kid. And that, I think we are very over-dependent on drugs and medication and prescriptions in America, as well as other countries as well. But, I do think that we need to better personalize the healthcare solutions and plans.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing with trouble kids, quote unquote, kids that grow up in a broken household, or kids that grow up in foster homes or adoption homes. Like, that's rough on kids, especially if you're in a foster home and your parents have claims that they want you. Like, no one can legally adopt you and put you in a better home because these parents want these kids for whatever reason, good or bad. And so, like, this whole thing of, like, they don't really have health care, in these foster homes and this kind of stuff. And so it's depriving these kids of financial help and of psychological help that they could need to move on from that point in their lives and just get a better life.
And, like, healthcare as a whole in our nation really needs to be looked at and needs to be restructured somehow. I don't know. I haven't come up with a solution yet, but I think that we need to start looking into healthcare and how we're using it to actually help people instead of use people.
Yeah, I may not be extremely educated in the realm of healthcare, but I know that I see problems, and therefore I know it's not working. I hear that, like, there are people who, they have to go bankrupt because they can't afford to pay their hospital bill. People are scared of going to the hospital, so they just don't go. They self-medicate. And just knowing that, I know that our healthcare system isn't working and something needs to change. I don't know how, and I don't know when, but I know it needs to happen. And I wish I could, offer a solution to that, but, like I said earlier, I'm not exactly extremely well educated on the structure of our healthcare in America. But I agree, we do need to restructure it.
See, and then that's a bad thing, because why don't we know what's happening in our healthcare?
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
we should be enlightened. We should be able to say this is how our government is helping us right now.
It's true. Well, and okay, here's a question for you guys. In the new presidential administration, with everybody's position being replaced and all this stuff happening, which do you think is going to happen first? A new healthcare system nationwide, or is marijuana going to get legalized? Do they go hand in hand? Is marijuana going to get legalized everywhere? Which do you guys think is going to happen first?
Oh, I think that is far off from happening. I mean, I've spent time in the Midwest and the South, and it is, like, here it's pretty lax to where, we can talk about this on the radio. But, I mean, if that were to happen somewhere, in the Bible Belt, I mean, no, I don't think that legalizing marijuana nationwide is as close as it should be. And neither do I think a complete, restructuring. I believe that right now what I've experienced is that this presidential administration they like to pretend that everything is okay. And, they like to focus on other problems that are more important to them. And to them, the younger generation's mental health isn't on the top of their list.
Right.
And so why would they restructure the entire healthcare system to better accommodate us? I don't think either are going to happen in this administration.
Right.
I think it's going to have to wait another presidency.
Right. Well, and this Deep South, like you're talking about, it's a largely conservative area, and so I totally see where that's coming from because, it's so different from where we are here. We're completely liberal. New Mexico is all Democratic almost everywhere, and with the new Congress elections, like, that's all you see on TV. It's just like all these different candidates running, and they talk about so many different things, and none of them talk about making our children safer. With the school shooting, they might mention it, but they're more concerned about, the wall that Trump is threatening to build, or, job opportunities in New Mexico. It's a smaller looking glass, but still it's not talked about, this whole youth mental issue, just this whole mental dependency in general.
I think this administration is all about quick thrills. Like, we talk about absurd ideas in this administration, and all of the politicians flock to that one idea and hype it up, and all, the more important problems that are happening in our nations are just overlooked because of all of the propaganda that's happening. Like, this election or this presidency is really crazy. It's really different from others. It's more materialistic. I can't think of a better word, but it's not. I just don't feel like they're really caring for the actual issues. It's more about really quick thrills. Let's talk about this. Let's make the nation go crazy really quick about, let's build a wall, and everyone goes crazy when they should be talking about how their children are dying because we're being forced to pop these pills, and we become addicted and become more violent, and more people are being killed.
Yeah, I feel like it's more about appearances than anything else. They want to appear professional and like they're really caring, but we're still here talking about this, so obviously nothing has been fixed. There are still school shootings. There was one just a couple weeks ago, and I mean it's like it's almost become normalized in the news, like, oh, another school shooting. But people died, kids died that didn't have to die, that shouldn't have died, and they'll never get to live their lives like they should have now because, someone decided that the right to have guns was more important than the right for us to live.
Yeah. I think it's really just I won't say a generational thing, but it's the people who see themselves as professional kind of look down on the kids who are maybe even on their way up to being professional or whatever, because with the new Netflix show 13 Reasons Why, if you don't know what that is, it's kind of it's about this girl who commits suicide, and she records these tapes, cassette tapes, and she tells everyone why she killed herself and what people she held responsible. And so I know when I watched the first season, at least, my parents and a lot of adults actually said to me that it was very gruesome, and I saw things on social media that said that it just showed way too many topics that weren't relevant. And what they didn't realize is that it's very relevant that it happens to people our own age. It happens to people, across us on the street. It's not irrelevant. And especially the second season of this show, it really shows what's going on now, and these adults who say that, it's not relevant, it's too gruesome for these kids to be watching. They just need to realize that it's not, because we already know, because it's happened to us.
Advice for older generations: if you want an insight to what high school life is like, watch 13 Reasons Why.
Exactly.
Not every single high school experience is a suicide like that, but the things that led to the suicide. I know I've experienced, I know my friends have experienced. And if you guys want, like, to see what it's like to be kids living in high school, I'd recommend that show to you. It's not gruesome. You need to be aware that it's real life. Real life is gruesome, and it's what happens.
Yeah, the show, it's gritty, it's real. You watch it, and it's almost like I'm uncomfortable watching this, because is this really what's happening in our schools to young people? That it's sad, and you just watch it, and you're really thinking like, wow, this is it. This is what it is. And I really feel like adults, they almost underestimate exactly like because we're kids, we couldn't possibly be having these kinds of thoughts. These are grown-up thoughts, you know? These are grown-up things. You don't do this, and you don't experience this in high school. And then they see it, and they're like, well, it's just a show. You're like, no, it's pretty real.
Yeah, they definitely don't beat around the bush. Like, that's probably the best way to describe it. You know, they don't leave explicit material out. They don't treat it like it's not a big deal. They make it what it is. And I think that, well, and especially in the second season, like, almost at the end of...
No spoilers.
No spoilers.
I haven't seen it yet.
No spoilers, no spoilers. But on the end of every episode, they had to put help finding help in a crisis, and they give
the suicide
hotline,
yeah.
Because it just brought so many emotions out for people who watched the first season and who went through this stuff, you know, like, that's real results. Like, if you have to put, like, here's a website called 13 Reasons Why that gives you a link to the suicide hotline, you know, if you have to put that on a TV show, like, that's sending a message that, like, even though this stuff is explicit and this stuff, like, is hard to watch, like, you already know that you've gone through it because you feel those same emotions, and it's so real for you that sometimes you need help too.
Definitely. Yeah, it's scary to think about, but like we were saying earlier, there are solutions. It's not this is the end of the road, this is it. We can't, get better after this. We can, and we discuss familiarizing ourselves with maybe the symptoms, and I think first talking to people and really understand what they're going through and where they're coming from, as opposed to prescribing them medications or even just brushing them off as just being a dramatic teenager or something. I really think that we were talking earlier that not our healthcare can't be a one size fits all, and that we need to personalize it, and we need to realize that these are people that we're dealing with. They're not numbers, they're not statistics, they're not just dollars. They're real people, and we do experience real problems, and not every solution will fit for one person.
Yeah, I think that's really what needs to happen, and especially in Washington, that's really where that mindset of like, okay, like this state or like this region, it gets so generalized, and you don't think about like all the people inside each category that don't fit what you're putting them into, and all this like generalization just leads to more problems. And like, yeah, it costs money to personalize healthcare, like Jackie was saying, but in the end, it will probably pay off more than all these people who are dying from psychiatric drug addiction or, addiction in general that's just so failing their health.
Because you can't generalize health. Everyone experiences different symptoms. Everyone's brain is made differently. Like, just because, let's say, we both have depression doesn't mean we both are experiencing the same things. And as for the South and the stigma that weed is bad, I think we just need to learn more. The government needs to become more comfortable with the fact that there are benefits that overweigh the cons to medical marijuana, and we just need to learn more. People need to do their research, and we need to understand the side effects of the drugs that we're using, and the government needs to be a big part of helping its people understand what's happening in their bodies.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think what most people are afraid of, and in New Mexico this has become a thing, is people driving while under an influence, whether it's alcohol or marijuana. I think that's really probably where the big scare, the big I want to stay away from that attitude comes from, because, there's so many different cases of, people driving under the influence and so many bad things happening. But like you said, I think education is probably just the best thing. How much is a legal limit? If you smoke this much, like, you shouldn't be driving, and this kind of stuff. Like, it's better than alcohol, but people don't really distinguish that, like, I don't know. It's just, education is definitely important.
Yep. Also consider new technology, or even like, services like Uber. I feel like they're just becoming so popular nowadays. Like, I don't know. I don't completely doubt like people just not having cars anymore. I mean, like, in big cities, people are really considering like, why buy a car if I can just buy an Uber, and then gas is going to be so much less expensive because I don't need to pay for it. I just pay this one fee to get where I need to go. And yeah, but also like you were definitely saying, like, we need to kind of lift this idea that all drugs are the same, and that they affect you in the same way, and that they are, even certain drugs can make you normal. And we need to really research and understand this, and realize how it affects our own mental health, and realize that talking about your own mental health, it isn't, some kind of taboo subject where we shouldn't be talking about it, because, if you talk about your mental health and something's wrong with you, you could be shooting up a school next, and it's so horrible. It should just be like, I'm looking after myself, and myself includes my mental health. And, you take a cold seriously, or the flu seriously, why wouldn't you take my mental illness seriously? Often, like, depression is called like the cold of the soul. It's something else. And I feel like because it's not physical, you can't see it, you can't see a mental illness, that somehow it's taken less seriously. And I really feel that as a society, we need to get over that, and that it's real. Mental health is real. I mean, it, you can feel it, when you just have off days, or you're just feeling really great. I mean, that is your mental health. And, if you've just had a lot of off days in a row, like, something's wrong, and I need to look at this, and I need to decide and figure out how to solve it, how to make myself feel well again.
And you'll be able to see that there's a problem with your mental health when you see that there's 17 new graves in Florida. And that just goes to prove, like, you might not be able to see it. It might not be taken as seriously, but in reality, it's the most serious type of sickness.
Yeah.
Definitely. All right. Well, that was a great session, but now it is time for us to go. If you'd like to contact us, you can reach us by emailing us at listen2us.ksfr@gmail.com. Or you could even find us on Instagram at listen_2us. Thank you so much for joining in with us today, and we will see you next month.
That's all, folks.
Thanks, guys.
And I'm just going to add a final note of thanks to this wonderful, incredible group of women. I sat and I was so inspired to hear what they had to say. This is often considered a point of view show, and I am so thankful that they were here with us today to share their point of view and give us a window into their world. And tell me again, ladies, the name of that series that you were talking.
It is 13 Reasons Why on Netflix.
Yes, the number 13 Reasons Why. There's 2 seasons.
Okay, and if you and you're saying you endorse that if you want to get a.
It shows how teenagers interact with one another really well.
Yeah.
In today's day and age.
We have about 1 minute left. I'm just quickly thinking, do you think we need to actually redefine what mental health is? Just curious.
I think that something that really needs to be said is that it can't always be changed. You know, it's not always on a day-to-day basis. You know, sometimes there's some things that you just can't control in your mental health, and I think a lot of people don't understand that.
Maybe
We definitely need to redefine our understanding of it and kind of remove this label of something is wrong with you, so therefore we're just going to give you this medicine and push you off to the side. You're no longer a problem. And that we need to focus that it is a progressive thing, it is an active thing, it's not passive. We need to actively take a part in our mental health.
And I would like to add that there's no such thing as normal. Everyone is different, and by trying to fit yourself in a little box by taking pills, that doesn't help you in any way. And if someone does feel like mentally their health is poor, do your research before you just choose a simple, easy way out, which is taking drugs.
And thank you all for joining us right here on Dialogue. We'll see you next week. And tune in the first Friday of every month. You will be able to listen to this incredible group of women bringing their voice to the table. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great week.
Talk to me. Talk to me.